to Elevate Louisiana Engage podcast. Elevate Louisiana was founded earlier this year to empower women leaders throughout Louisiana by connecting and educating them on the challenges impacting our state with data-driven, nonpartisan solutions to make a better future for Louisiana. Hello, I'm your host, Julie Stokes. Today, we are recording our second in a four-part series on the state of higher education in Louisiana. The 4 videocasts that we are recording are a prologue to an interactive webinar on August 28th between the members of Elevate Louisiana and our 4 speakers. Elevate's August 28th webinar will be a forum where our members will discuss Louisiana's higher education policies with the policy makers themselves so that our civic leaders can get more engaged in building a better future for our state. Our guest today is Martha Snyder, a Senior Director at HCM Strategists. HCM is a national group of policy advocates and strategists working toward equitable and meaningful change by bridging the gap between public policies and the people they affect. Martha Snyder is an experienced education policy specialist who works with federal and state policymakers. She provides policy expertise and strategic counsel on a wide range of areas from finance to accountability to college readiness and to affordability. Welcome, Martha.
Thank you, Julie.
I'm so excited about this conversation with you. I'm a data girl myself, and I love opportunities to contrast Louisiana to other states. You know, living in a nation composed of states provides each individual state the opportunity to study the results achieved by others with their policies. You know, we're all experiments in democracy and experiments in policy. I know that you'll have a lot of interesting information to share with us, so I'm going to turn it over to you to start our discussion. I see that you've come ready with a PowerPoint, and if we could just interact while you share that with our membership, that would be amazing.
Great, absolutely. Thanks so much for having me today and for engaging in this important conversation. Appreciate what you are trying to do in that platform you've set up in Louisiana to do this. So I thought I would share focusing in on kind of state finance issues and putting Louisiana, some of the trends in Louisiana in the perspective certainly of national trends, but also in terms of how the state's finance and funding undergirding higher ed advances or inhibits progress towards some important goals for the state, including economic prosperity and individual prosperity as well. So diving in, first and foremost, and this is a prior to COVID-19, but prior to COVID-19, even with record low unemployment, there was already underway a dramatic shift in the structure and availability of jobs, with growing need for education and training to really match a changing labor market. And we know from the Great Recession that those individuals with education and training beyond high school, particularly those with the post-secondary credential and degrees, are more likely to remain employed and find jobs during an economic recovery. So this places the state's goal, 60% of working age adults to hold a degree or certificate of value by 2030, an even more urgent category. You can see here that Louisiana's attainment rate in 2018 was 47.3%, compared to a national average of 51.3%. And similar to trends nationally, perhaps most concerning are the gaps that exist between different demographic populations, notably white populations and populations of color. So this certainly requires that Louisiana develop policies, and particularly direct resources, in ways that are targeted to achieve equitable access and success for all individuals.
Yeah, could we go back to that for a second? Because, you know, at first when I was looking at it and I was thinking about it ethnically, I thought, well, we're just such a melting pot. We've got a lot more diversity, you know, but we're falling behind in every single category.
Yes, yes, you are behind overall and behind on all demographic populations. And again, you know, even though your white population has higher attainment than the populations of color, that is well below the national average as well. And that's certainly access, opportunity, without a doubt, and certainly the financing and funding system plays a role in that.
Yeah, thanks.
So thought I would put kind of the higher education spending in perspective, and this is looking exclusively at Louisiana and the percentage of higher ed spending as a percentage of the overall state budget. You'll see that very catch-all other category that is the majority of spending in the state, but that includes things not explicitly listed here. So certainly um, um, parks and recreation and other types of activities. But for the most part, you will see, not unlike national trends, the percent share of spending for higher ed and even for education overall has declined from fiscal year 7 to fiscal year 19. And the majority of that crowding out, as we call it, crowding out, particularly of higher education, has come from an increased share, an increased proportion of Medicaid expenses. Again, this is not atypical of national trends, but overall higher education spending in Louisiana compared to the nation is below the national average, and that's at 10.1%. So you have dipped below that national average, and again, the overall trends are similar, but the percent share is well below the national average.
And I'm surprised when I look at higher ed hovering, even though that's a decent amount of change, 9.5 to 8.3. When you look at 2007 to 2019, that still seems like understated amount of change. And what I'm thinking is that this may count both tuition and state spending, whereas we've switched a lot of the spending on education from the state to the student.
That's
and
right.
so okay.
Yes, so certainly I'll actually dive into that right now, but the general trend here is, to your point, 9.5% and 8.3%, neither of those are significant amounts compared to overall, and particularly compared to the growing need for opportunity, post-secondary opportunity, and attainment within the state, but also nationally. But certainly to your point, Julie, that you just raised, total FTE spending, so this is both student tuition is the orange, blue is the actual state support. So total spending is actually down, and most concerning of all certainly is the disinvestment of the state overall. So you're shifting more of the burden to students, even as the overall revenue that institutions are receiving is decreasing. And certainly, just to put this again in some national perspective, state investment is about just over 5,500, close to 6,000, whereas the national average is hovering at $8,000 overall. So a significant gap between national as well as just the overall spending that we see in Louisiana as it relates to higher education. And again, not only has the state share shifted, but we're seeing increasing share of the burden being placed on students. When you look back to fiscal year 11, the total share that students were paying into higher education was 27%. It is now at 48%. And while you're not horribly off of the national average, one of the things, if you go back to that prior slide, is that the overall revenue is lower. So the institutions in Louisiana are receiving less overall revenue per FTE than they are nationally, and 48% of that revenue is coming from the student share.
Interesting. And it doesn't seem to like when I look at the names of the states to our left and right, there doesn't seem to be any sort of trend I can see. I think you've got a mix of political ideologies on both sides of us.
Yeah, it's I think certainly one of the factors is often higher education is the balancing wheel of state budgets. So you just have a general national disinvestment in higher education. There has been some recovery since the Great Recession. Certainly that's put in the balance right now, given the economic conditions. So this is just an overall, trend that we see nationally. And yes, you're right. The kind of share of student share, there's no kind of overall trend in terms of ideology or even geographic regionally. Just that students are burdening a larger share. So the result of this is massive increases in tuition. And just to put some numbers into perspective, we're talking 74% increases from 2005 in the two-year sector, and 99% tuition increases in the four-year sector. You still remain, interestingly, overall tuition is below national averages in both sectors. But one of the important aspects of this as well is certainly the overall state grant, the ability to kind of reduce that cost for certain student populations, and that has not kept pace. Additionally, and perhaps even more importantly, is placing this in a percentage of median income at a state level. And here again, you see concerning trends. It not only the share of tuition or tuition as a percentage of median income increasing, but increasing at fairly substantial rates, dating back particularly over the last 5 years. If you look at that spike, it has declined a little bit in recent years, but certainly not back to pre-recession levels.
Wow. That doesn't bode well for being able to have the least among us climb out of the hole that they're in.
That's right. And that's exactly, I think, one of the important narratives here is, cost of education in Louisiana. When you go back to the prior slide and look at, tuition compared to national averages, it doesn't seem unreasonable. That being said, putting it into the perspective of the population within your state, it makes it pretty unattainable for a lot of individuals, and particularly for those individuals that most need access and support.
Well, and if you go back to that previous slide and you look at that tuition amount, mm-hmm. and you think $9,614 a year, and that when you think about the dollars that we're involving here, so that's out of probably, what was that other number? Was that 21%? So that's out of a fairly small family income. Right. To try to find that kind of money is what I would think extremely challenging.
Yes, it definitely makes affordability and access pretty limited for most of the population, particularly with those without means. And that even this slide, right? This slide, I hesitated to include this because it seems like Louisiana is doing well. That being said, the title of this slide says a lot as well. This is the percent of bachelor's degree recipients with debt. So this is, 49% of your bachelor degree recipients are graduating with some level of debt. I'll get to that average number in just a moment. But the important thing here is this is implying that these students have access to pursue a bachelor's degree, and that they were not inhibited by the price upfront or detracted on their way to pursue that. More concerning, of which there is very little data and information, are those individuals that started off on their post-secondary path and did not complete and end up burdened with debt. And that number is probably rather stark in many states, but that is also a data point that's very difficult to come by. And even when you're talking about it, right, average debt of those bachelor degree recipients is about $27,000 in Louisiana. Again, when you look at it compared to the national averages, it seems reasonable, I suppose. But again, my point on this is you're not counting those students that didn't even have access because the affordability hurdle was too great for them. So I'm just going to shift a little bit into, and just to put some policy perspective into this. One of the ways that we also often advocate for states to combat increased student costs is to offset with aid. From an equity perspective, particularly from directing grant resources to those individuals that have the greatest financial need, we advocate that aid be delivered in the form of need-based financial aid. Certainly, as you can see here, the majority of grant aid provided by the state is non-need based. It's through your TOPS program, which is a very well regarded program, but certainly does need to be considered in terms of the particular direction of those resources for students who have financial need and whose barriers might be financial rather than academic.
Yeah, well, one of the things that always struck me too is that in the legislature, during the term that I was in from 2012 through 2020, people would always talk about how TOPS has grown to be out of control. And it's like, well, TOPS is out of control because we transferred the cost of education from the state to the student. So now you forgot that you were paying the tuition. So now the tuition's up, but and that's not even, some of that thinking, doesn't even take into effect the need and non-need based, which is a big deal.
That's right. Yeah. So yes, when you have a guarantee like TOPS is, and you're increasing tuition, or tuition costs are going up, your costs of that financial aid program are going to go up. And yeah, certainly we can get into the policy discussion around need versus non-need, but yeah, you're right in terms of the growth of that program and what's driving it.
Yeah.
Again, just to put this in, the blue bar here shows some increases in need-based financial aid through the GO grant, and overall increases, to your point you just made, right? That spike, if you were to map it to spikes in tuition or trends in tuition, it would be pretty highly correlated.
Yeah. Yeah, and can we go back to 16, 17? Oh, that's because we cut TOPS, because TOPS got cut because we couldn't quite come to grips with a budget.
Putting just, again, expenditures in financial aid or grant aid in some regional perspective here compared to other states. In state grant investments in Louisiana, again, comprise a higher share of the overall investment in higher education compared to the national average. So even though your overall share of investment in higher ed is below the national average, higher majority of that, or higher percentage of that, is going to financial aid through TOPS again. So not even going directly to the institutions. We had the dip in 2016-17, again, because of the budget, and compared to your regional states, the SREB states that we use as a regional comparison, definitely has grown more rapidly.
And in Louisiana, like I said, we have to be careful, because when you look at state spending, it depends on how it's presented at the moment, but sometimes tuition is counted in that, and because fees and other self-generated revenue in some of the metrics gets counted as state spending, but not in this one, right? This is just
the total state grant expenditures. Yep.
Yeah,
that's correct. Yeah, this is just looking at how much of your overall investment in higher ed, which is low at the state level, is going to financial aid.
Yeah. Right, because we're covering tuition instead of direct payments to universities. Okay.
So I just want to talk a little bit about some of the policy, again, the policy environment in the state. One of the things that we do at HCM, and I think, the recent changes that that Commissioner Reed has put into place, and the development of the master plan, highly focused on equity and access and attainment, has been supplemented by directing the funding that the state does provide to institutions through a fairly robust and well-designed outcomes-based funding model. So we do an analysis of states on outcomes-based funding around how that funding is being directed to institutions in ways that align with state goals and objectives. And you'll see here that Louisiana's funding model. So the funding that is getting to institutions is being allocated in a pretty strong way. Of course, we would argue that more funding should be directed to institutions through this funding formula.
Yeah, but you think our outcome-based model is pretty good.
Yes, yes, it's so we assess nationally all of the funding models in states. You'll see formula type there, type 4. That's our highest or most robust funding level that we not funding level, but funding model that we assign. So yes, Louisiana's funding model is strong in terms of its design.
That's good. You know, one thing, and it might, and I'm not sure if you're going to go here, and it might be more reflective of the conversations in the past slides, but I'd be interested to see in higher ed spending in other states how much pension debt, how much in pension debt payments is counted. Because I know, like, for instance, for every professor, for every faculty of any kind, for every administrative person that's employed in our higher education system, at least 28, 29% of their salaries being allocated to old pension debts that have nothing to do with the current dollar being worked. It has to do with the fact that legislatively we've kicked the can down the road for a number of years and amortized pension costs like tiny and then blowing up at the end, which is where we are now. But you know, one thing that we might want to follow up on in the webinar, if you can get any information on that, because that would show what I find that it shows, like in education, is that it looks like we're spending more on education than we would have like 12 years ago with inflation. But then when you break it down and you take that pension debt payment increase out, we're way behind.
Yes. Yeah, and that's in terms of there are some states that are following or in Louisiana's footsteps in terms of pension being a significant driver of spending or a significant portion of spending. And certainly I can follow up in the webinar with that information, putting some of that into perspective. That would be a concerning trend and certainly a misleading trend in terms of rising costs of higher ed when it is in fact a majority or a good proportion going to buy down old pension obligations.
Yeah, thanks.
Again, just looking at kind of the need-based financial aid in the state, there was that tiny blue bar. You did develop the Louisiana Go grant. Again, this is just our assessment of that funding. We would advocate that more funding be spent on need-based financial aid, again, as an important access and equity policy lever. And again, majority of your spending is going to the TOPS grant, which again has high outcomes for those students that receive them, but there are upfront criteria that can be prohibitive or certainly not providing financial support to non-traditional age students, so students that aren't coming out of high school and enrolling directly into post-secondary opportunities, of which there are a significant number in Louisiana that should be considered as part of your policy conversation.
Yeah, because I worry about those guys all the time, because it's one thing if you get out of high school and I mean, if you weren't able to have TOPS, then that's you've got an issue there. But when you think about I would think have a lot of people that don't quite finish college, something gets in the way, something stops them, and they don't turn their eye toward achieving that degree too many years later, and they're not eligible for TOPS. They're trying to feed a family, and $9,000 a year would be a big chunk. I mean, even if you're making $100,000 and you've got 2 kids, that's 10% of your family income. So I mean, and most people in Louisiana make a lot less than that.
Yeah, and that is one of the things, right, about a program such as TOPS, which is again, it's a well-regarded program for the students that have access to it. You can see, I'm not going to read off the outcomes. The outcomes for students that have access to it are strong outcomes. But there are certainly students that are left not receiving aid, and that particularly those students that are non-traditional age, those that are not going directly from high school, or those that are looking to reskill themselves, to upskill themselves, that may have started and dropped out and are looking to return, or never started a post-secondary pursuit when they first left high school. So certainly something to consider, particularly in the current environment. with the impacts of the pandemic, the economic impacts, the impacts on employment, and certainly the shifting economy, and just the very real reality that many of those jobs that were there prior to COVID-19 are not going to be there when we're through the pandemic.
Scary.
I thought actually if I would maybe just spend a minute in terms of our forward-looking thinking on this. So that 13.3% unemployment rate is what I pulled for Louisiana in, I think that was as of May 30. And certainly we know if we were to break that down, I guess, again, demographically and income and by education level, we know disparate impacts. Those with limited education beyond high school and populations of color have disparate impacts across a whole host of outcomes, unemployment being one of them as it relates to COVID-19. And we feel state investment in post-secondary education is critical to economic recovery, particularly coming out of this pandemic. We do see some positives in the way that the governor has directed some of the GEAR dollars, that Federal CARE Act dollars, but you see still a 15.3 million out of 50 million went to post-secondary education. Some of that directed at that very population we were talking about, those students or those individuals that want to pursue some upskilling, short-term credentials, and then certainly some resources being provided to just connectivity and all of those broadband and technology issues that we know have, again, had disparate impacts for certain populations.
Yeah, that's a big part of our issues here is just broadband access. And, I thought that was mainly a rural area. But I know in my own home parish, which is Jefferson, which is the second largest parish in the state, our public school system had 50% of the kids without internet access. I thought, my gosh, how does that happen?
Yes, it is definitely not. You would think. I think the default is that it is a rural issue, but it is as much in urban or highly populated. Again, it's more economic, I think, than it is geography.
Yeah.
So again, just leading into some recommendations, and certainly we can talk about this on the webinar. I think there's great connectivity to just the overarching goal of the work that you're doing. But the fact that Louisiana has had a downward trend in its investment in post-secondary education even before this latest economic crisis, oftentimes one of the first things to get cut in a recession or in budgetary challenges is higher ed, because of the belief that institutions can make that up through particularly increases in tuition. So in an effort to try and stop that trend and try to recognize that post-secondary is going to be the avenue out of the economic crisis, and particularly for specific individuals, we're recommending that states kind of take a step back. And once they're out of the immediate crisis of pandemic and what happens with just returning to school, really starting to take a more strategic cross-agency, cross-stakeholder look at the resources that can be brought to bear to provide post-secondary opportunities for individuals.
One of the things that we always talk about in Louisiana, and I'd love to know how common this is, but we talk about the fact that every time there's a bad budget problem, the things that get cut are higher education and healthcare. Mm-hmm. But the problem is that those are the only two. It's not the only two. We can get to just about everything in terms of cuts, but because they make up such a large percentage of state general fund dollars, that it comes off like 80% of the cuts end up there because they're the large dollars. And obviously those Medicaid, vendor payments, that's a massive amount of it. But higher ed is still one of the highest numbers that we have. We're unable to, and I'm not saying it's a good idea to do this at all. I'm not a proponent of this, but like even our K through 12 education is protected against budget cuts. But higher ed isn't. I'd love to know when we get together on the webinar, how common is that? Is that something that it's just kind of the cry that's always heard here. Oh, well, every time something happens, it's only higher ed and healthcare. And it's like, well, it's not only higher ed and healthcare. They just happen to make up the by far and large, biggest proportion of spending there is. So it feels that way for sure.
Yeah, I think it's both the common cry, and I do think there is something to it. I mean, the right higher ed, to your point, is not it's not a mandated spend. It's a discretionary spend, and so there is flexibility to cut it. And I do believe that there's this general belief, and this goes to the increased shifting of the cost to students. You can do that. There is a secondary revenue source that exists in higher ed, and quite honestly in healthcare in some ways, that makes it seem less dire for the system overall. But when you're talking about the goals and creating opportunities, it definitely has an impact. The more you cut and the more you shift costs to students or to other revenue sources, the more limiting opportunities become.
Yeah. 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 And when you're a state like us with so many people to really lift out of poverty, the most constructive way to lift people out of poverty is a good education.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, and so, but certainly I can provide some additional perspective on that in terms of, one of the cyclical trends oftentimes of state investment in higher ed is actually counter-cyclical to the demand for it. So we see increased demand for post-secondary in times of economic decline, but decreased state investment in it. So it's it's kind of counterbalanced from what you would like to see, and it's a struggle to figure out how to get states to buck that trend because of the realities that they're dealing with when it comes to revenue shortfalls and budgetary restrictions.
Yeah, one of the calculations I had done when things were at their worst, I had done a comparison before a lot of the higher ed cuts had kind of started to happen, which would have been like 2007. Well, and I actually tried to go back pre-Katrina, because anything that you do in Louisiana that compares to 2006, 7, 8 is got a big Katrina effect. So if you compared 2005, which ended before the storm, and you compared that to like 2000, I think 16 or might have been 15 was the worst of our budget cuts to higher ed. You look at what a student is spending on their education and what they're getting for that tuition in terms of overall dollars being spent. And the graph on that was just eye popping, because for an individual's investment, they were getting so much less.
Right.
It was just such a sad statistic. It's not what we want for our state, I don't think.
No, and tuition is the other thing is tuition is also only one part of the costs that individuals face to pursue post-secondary opportunities. So certainly it provides a sticker shock for all of us, but to your point that you made earlier, a lot of these individuals they have to make a decision between full-time work and part-time work, supporting a family and pursuing post-secondary opportunities, living costs, all of those other factors that go into making the decision to enter post-secondary. Tuition is just one of them. And when that's skyrocketing along with everything else, it really makes access to those opportunities pretty limiting.
Yeah, the opportunity cost, if you're working full time, or in a lot of cases a professional, you're working more than full time, to have that opportunity. I mean, I can remember when I first started in accounting that I had a desire to go back and get more education, because at that point you didn't have to have a master's. You pretty much have to have a master's now. And I remember thinking, it's not a thing. It's not a thing that I can do, because I can't find the time and I can't afford it inside of the dollars that I'm making as a young professional. So I kind of, quit that idea. And certainly in the perspective of what we're dealing with in Louisiana, I was probably in a much better situation to handle it than most.
Right. Yep. The opportunity cost is very real. And it's very decisions that individuals have to make. So just again, maybe just to put some additional ideas out there. One of the things that we, again, are trying to work towards, particularly in this particular crisis that states are dealing with, and the real need for post-secondary opportunities. One is certainly for states to target resources in ways that are equity focused. And by this, we mean, again, making sure that there are opportunities provided to individuals that are least well-resourced. So certainly populations of color, displaced workers, adult populations, those that are supporting families. Related to that, certainly, trying to advance student-centered and workforce-aligned strategies, getting students into, or individuals into, pathways that lead into high-paying, high-value opportunities and careers. We, again, advocate for protecting and expanding need-based financial aid. The expand part of that goes back to making sure that non-traditional age students, those that are not pursuing post-secondary directly from high school, have access to financial resources to cover their expenses, particularly if tuition is going up. We, again, argue for states to evaluate and broaden the resources that they're considering as part of their post-secondary universe. So there's a lot of workforce training related dollars. Those should be part of the conversation. How are states leveraging those to advance towards needed opportunities and outcomes for the state and for individuals? And certainly the revenue structure, both that's going into post-secondary, but even more broadly as a state. And then again, building in expectations for student success. And that certainly relates to the earlier aforementioned outcomes-based funding model, directing these resources, giving institutions more dollars, but also expecting that they're providing access and opportunity for the students that they're serving.
Mm-hmm. One of the things we had on our last videocast, we had Dr. Jim Henderson, who runs the University of Louisiana system. And he was talking about the new Compete LA, which is about going back and completing your bachelor's degree for students that have been out of college for, I don't know, some amount of time. And I imagine that that'll be a good thing for us to talk about in the webinar as well, with you, about any ideas from around the country, that can be incorporated.
Absolutely. Yeah. Certainly that kind of, those incentives, we see a lot of good examples and successful examples of institution systems, states providing targeted resources to those, and incentives to those that started on their post-secondary career but fell short of completion. Other things that we see is states evaluating their debt collection policy. So students that carry a debt with an institution or with the system, oftentimes they have to pay off that debt before they can return to a campus or an institution. We see states starting to reverse that and saying, you know what, let's get you to complete your degree. Let's waive your debt for now. And then when you have the resources to pay it back, we can, but again, those are barriers to just students pursuing opportunities that certainly, are things to consider. Relatively low cost as well, low cost, high return.
Yeah. One of the things that we had, it was a bill that I actually carried, trying to figure out how to manage the cost of tops, and what do we do when so many, and I don't have the numbers anymore because this was a few years ago, but when recipients would get in there and then not pass, and then their first year, there went all that tuition, they didn't pass, and we had no stopgap on the back end of that to try to recover those dollars. And the concern, I guess, is that kids are going to get in there, not take it seriously because they don't have out of pocket. I don't know how true that is actually, because our fees and stuff still come out of pocket. But should we consider any sort of limits, or where it becomes a loan or anything when a student gets in there and just doesn't take it seriously? Obviously you'd have to have a lot of exceptions, because things can happen that have nothing to do with a kid not wanting to do the work. I mean, you could lose a parent, or any number of things could happen. But what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that is definitely a challenge to balance and to get to get right to all of the points that you just made. But certainly we do see financial aid or aid programs that have certain benchmarks or expectations built into them for students to maintain progress towards a credential or a degree. And, again, making sure that they're designed in a way that is achievable. So not Indiana, for example, has a program that requires that students maintain or complete 30 credit hours within the first academic year. So that doesn't require full-time course load. It requires that students complete 30 credit hours an academic year. They see success with that. We feel that those are actually fairer benchmarks than having benchmarks that prohibit access upfront. So GPA requirements and those types of things, we'd rather see broader access and then benchmarks that provide signals to students about maintaining their award.
Yeah, I like that. So one of the other things that comes up a lot in Louisiana is that there's this either myth or truth, and I'd love to know which one is true, but that we have too many institutions. People talk about that all the time, and any attempts we've had to try to trim it down don't really seem to politically work. Some of the attempts I've heard to trim it down, it's like, that's not a good idea. And then, everything from, sometimes I don't believe it's true at all, because a lot of times, we're dealing with the biggest costs are pension debt, and then debt on facilities. And a lot of those costs are still there. There's universities you can close and not even save that much money, is from everything I've ever seen. So if we could bond, like if we could ever get some information on, do we really have many more institutions than everyone else? And, or do we have too many governing boards? I don't know. It's like, I don't tend to be one that necessarily prescribes to that, and I'm not giving a political opinion on that one way or the other, but I'm curious about it, either to really say this is a thing or to dispel the myth.
Yeah, and I certainly the governance discussion can become a political quagmire in terms of and divert actual progress.
That's right.
And one of the things, so certainly doing that evaluation, to me, I would say a better use of time would be for making sure, right, that institutions are effectively and efficiently utilizing the resources, not just resources in terms of money, but the buildings. Are they, particularly for the students that we're talking about, are they providing more flexible access and opportunities and schedules? So are they getting more efficient use out of their buildings and the resources that they have? And the other is, there could be something for some regional collaboration around programs and coordination and efficiencies to be found there that don't require shutting down of institutions, but making sure that redundancy is limited, in terms of the same program being offered at 5 institutions in the same area. So there's certainly some efficiencies that I think can be pursued that would be a better conversation than, overall governance reform or shutting down institutions. And there's states that have done some good work on that in terms of, trying to square that or balance that need for increased efficiency, certainly, but not getting caught up in a pretty difficult fight that can ultimately not lead to progress.
Yeah, well, I agree. And I don't know if you had any more slides. Do you have any more?
No, that's it.
I thought that was it. Well, that's about all the time we have for today. I'd like to thank you. I'd like to thank our guest, Martha Snyder. We look forward to spending more time with you on August 28th. And to those of you that are out here watching, if you're interested in joining Elevate Louisiana and want to be part of the larger interactive webinar on August 28th, please contact us through social media on Facebook at Elevate LA. That's at ELLEVATELA, or by emailing us at elevatela ELLEVATELA at stokesflame.com. Our website will go active on August 1st in just a few weeks. So by the time you see this, it may even be active. But in the meantime, you can contact us in those ways. And don't forget to like Elevate Louisiana on all of your social media platforms. I'm your host, Julie Stokes, and we'll see you next time.